Well, this past April, I enrolled in a 14-week online class called the Fundamentals of Embodiment course. It's been an experiential overview of something called somatics, a field of study that focuses on internal physical perception and experience, both in oneself and in others. The course has been really fascinating, and it has involved me experiencing everything from something called Feldenkrais therapy, which some of you may have heard of, and Krav Maga martial arts, to improv and even a dancing class. Really, it has been an eye-opener. I have been amazed to discover a wide range of capacities and experiences within our bodies of which I simply had no awareness or experience previously, and which I believe really delight the heart of God for us to discover, because after all, we believe He gave us those capacities. So no doubt because of this context, I read today's gospel stories from a perspective of particular curiosity about the kinds of human awareness that we witness in Jesus. It's easy to miss these when we're attracted to often the more kind of dramatic aspects of the stories. So I invite you to join me today as we consider three distinctive ways that Jesus interacts with people and situations. Ways that I believe we're invited to emulate as people committed to following Him as His disciples. At the beginning of today's reading, Jesus and His disciples had just crossed the Sea of Galilee, where a large crowd immediately gathers to be near Jesus. As we heard, Jesus has been approached by a wealthy and honestly religiously influential man, Jairus, who literally falls down at Jesus' feet and pleads with him to come to his house to heal his little girl, who is on the verge of death. So the situation is clearly desperate. While Jesus and His disciples are following Jairus home, no doubt hurried by Jairus' own urgency, the huge crowd of people is pressing in on Jesus. And it's in the midst of this crowd, it's interesting, the word crowd is mentioned 3 times in these verses. In the midst of this crowd, we come to this first case of Jesus' extraordinary, fully human, I would argue, sensitivity. A woman who's desperate from having suffered from a bleeding disorder for 12 years reaches out her hand and touches the edge of Jesus' outer robe. Now, mind you, she doesn't touch Him directly, just the edge of His robe. And surprisingly, Jesus stops in His tracks because He senses something has just happened. So He turns around and He asks out loud, who touched my clothes? Talk about a highly sensitive person. So Jesus' disciples are gathered around, and they're in the midst of the press too, and they basically say to Jesus, what kind of a question is that? You see the crowd pressing in on us. How can you possibly ask who touched you? Like, seriously? And I just love Jesus' response to both the disciples and the woman in this story. See, He has no ego that needs boosted, so He doesn't explain Himself to His disciples at all. Nor does He pull rank and say, look, guys, I'm the rabbi, and if I ask a question, you'd better respect me and pay attention. One thing that we learn here from Jesus is that when others treat us dismissively, especially when they dismiss our attending to something that we're noticing about what God's doing, we need not allow it to wound our egos and get us on our high horses. Instead of taking His disciples' dismissiveness to heart, He continues in the truth of what He's just experienced in His body in concert with God, and He looks for who has touched Him in faith. And as a result of this, He sees the woman, and He listens to her whole story. You know, I'm thinking that probably took a couple minutes. So He pauses and He listens to her whole story. And as a result, He really sees this woman. He truly sees her as someone who trusts God. He truly sees her as courageous, because she has to admit that she wasn't really supposed to touch Him, but she did. So she has to admit that. And He also truly sees her as belonging to God and His covenant people. He names her daughter. He sees her, and He, I believe, just delights in her. He speaks words of affirmation and blessing to her, restoring to her not only physical health, but her covenantal connection with the people of God. because now she's no longer an outcast. We learn from Jesus the importance of staying sensitive and attentive to the people in whom we perceive God working. Stay attentive to them with our presence, our attention, and even our honest admiration. This will often require intentionally slowing things down a bit to make room for people. And honestly, when we do that, sometimes dealing with our own stuff as we're listening and maybe trying to practice patience because we're not really feeling like slowing down. So we do that to be like Jesus, because that's how Jesus is. We listen to the whole truth with patience and respect. And when we do this, we really see people, we really hear them. And I can say to you, the experience of doing that moves us into a place where loving people as we love ourselves happens very naturally and organically. We don't have to work it up. A second case of Jesus' distinctive sensitivity occurs right as Jesus is conversing with the woman, as people from Jairus' home arrive and tell Jairus the bad news that his dear little girl has died, so he shouldn't bother the teacher anymore. I'm struck here by the great dismissiveness with which the people delivering this message treat Jairus. Hearing that his child has just died has to be one of the worst, if not the worst moment in this man's life. Yet instead of being sensitive to that, the people delivering the message seem to be more worried about the protocol of disturbing the teacher than they are with how Jairus feels at this moment. And they're dismissive too, honestly, of what the presence and power of Jesus can actually accomplish, even in the worst situations, because they just see him as a teacher. To borrow the phrase from J.B. Phillips' famous little treatise, their God is too small. And again, I love how Jesus responds here and what we can learn from him. Jesus attends to Jairus and his pain. He slows things down right in the middle of all the action and hurry and press around him. This reminds me of those moments in movie dramas when someone has just received a life-threatening injury and someone who loves them and cares about them gets right in their face and says, "Stay with me, stay with me." Jesus, no doubt, looking straight into Jairus' eyes, says, "Do not fear, only believe. Stay with me, Jairus, stay with me." And I imagine Jairus, as Jesus stops the rest of the crowd from following them anymore, is now able to focus on seeing and feeling Jesus very near to him. And I imagine Jairus in this setting kind of holding his breath, trying to hold off panic, and continuing to lead Jesus right into the heart of his greatest fear and pain, into his home, where there's a troop of professional mourners already mourning, no doubt his bereft wife, and the eerily silent body of his beloved little girl. When we find ourselves in the company of people who are understandably on the verge of being really overwhelmed by fear, we are invited as disciples to follow Jesus, to stay very close to him and to them, looking them in the eye, reminding them quietly but firmly not to give over to fear, but to keep believing that in the midst of terrible circumstances, they're not going to be forsaken by Jesus or by us, but that they have his full attention and ours. To keep believing that though they cannot see a way out, that they'll not face this alone. Jesus will keep on accompanying them right into their places of pain and darkness, and that we'll come along too as far as we can if they'd like. To keep believing that Jesus has a way of quieting commotion and staying near, very near to us in all circumstances. As the psalmist experienced, "Where can I go from you? Where can I flee from your presence? If I fly to the heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in the depths of Sheol, you are there." As our Dutch sister Corrie ten Boom learned amidst the darkness, evil, and death of the Holocaust concentration camps, truly, There is no pit so deep that God is not deeper still. And now we come to our third and final example of Jesus' extraordinary sensitivity to the people he encounters. In this case, the professional mourners in Jairus' home, who have begun to loudly weep and wail over the little girl's death. Honestly, I think too often when I've read this story, I've been tempted to dismiss these mourners. I mean, after all, we already know what's going to happen, right? Our egos kind of like the fact that Jesus is going to show them what's what in just a minute by raising the little girl from the dead after they mock him. I mean, there's kind of a poetic justice there that I kind of think is neat. But I remind us again that Jesus does not have an ego that he's protecting here. So when he says to them, "Why do you make a commotion and weep? The child is not dead but sleeping," I don't think it's with some kind of just watch what I'm going to do kind of attitude. I say this because if we read the text carefully, when Jesus has raised Jairus' daughter, he strictly orders the people who witnessed the miracle that no one be told what happened. No, when Jesus speaks to the mourners, "Why are you making a commotion? The child is not dead but sleeping," despite the fact that they respond with a kind of mocking laughter, I believe Jesus is actually trying to preserve them from losing face. He's giving them an out for when the little girl suddenly ends up being alive in just a couple hours after they were mourning at the house. What is that going to do to their mourning business if they can't figure out when it's the right time to mourn or not? We live in a culture right now that's dominated by mocking and laughter of those who say things that we think are clearly not true, just like the mourners laughed at Jesus. Here, Jesus said, the little girl is not dead, she's only asleep. And the professional mourners do what many of us find ourselves doing today, laughing at how foolish Jesus' words are, sharing the joke among ourselves of how absolutely silly someone is who doesn't see the truth that we see so clearly that's right on the end of their noses. And yet, in the end, those who mock and laugh themselves end up being absolutely wrong about the situation. For our God calls the things that aren't as though they were, and those things that are not as though they are. So I see here in the exchange between Jesus and the professional mourners an example of why we need to indeed guard against judging others and against calling them fools or fill in the blank for what we call people who don't see things the way we do, the way Jesus taught elsewhere. He said to be very careful of that. As disciples of Jesus, we're really not afforded the luxury of mocking and laughing at people with whom we disagree, even when they mockingly laugh at us, because when we do that, that blinds us to really see who they are. We minimize them. We don't get the whole story. And when we don't really see people, frankly, it's tough, if not impossible, to really love them. And that's what we're called to do. So instead, like Jesus, we're called to treat them with respect, even while perhaps escorting them out of the place where people are suffering and God is at work doing something unexpected. Jesus putting all the laughing mourners outside is done in a way that, once again, I believe we're called to emulate, to calm the commotion like he did the raging sea when the disciples were afraid of drowning, like he did with the crowd when the woman desperately touched his garment, like he had just done by not allowing the crowd to keep following him to Jairus' house. Jesus calms down the noise and the chaos, and he slows things down so that he and his disciples can turn their full attention and their full presence without distraction to the suffering parents and to the little girl whose body probably hasn't even gone cold yet. And in response, in that resulting stillness of that now quiet house, Jesus follows Jairus and his wife, no doubt, into the little girl's room, and he speaks, "Talitha kum," little girl, get up. And he restores her and her whole family to life. And that kind of thing, that is the kind of thing, it's the kingdom of God, it's the thing God delights in, to accompany his beloved ones to their dark places, to the crosses in our lives where it looks like evil is winning, to walk with us to it, through it, and beyond it. But often it's in quiet places that go unnoticed if we're not paying attention, but which actually allows us to witness the kind of life that Jesus talked about when he said that we don't live by bread alone. In the words of the Christian spiritual director and poet Macrina Wiederkehr, love is not blind. It can see what microscopes have never seen. You do not have to be afraid in love's presence. You will not be used or taken lightly. You will not be ignored or laughed at. Your goodness will be seen with pure eyes, the pure eye of truth. Love's glance is sometimes gentle, sometimes stern to fit your need. It falls on you like morning dew or like a lightning bolt. But it is vision to the very end. Love is vision, and it is not afraid. As followers of Jesus, we are to trust the words of Jesus, words that often don't seem to make any sense in the moment, but that bring a kind of real sense to our lives if we learn to fully attend to the human hopes and fears that surround us and keep choosing to trust as we stand or walk for as long as it takes until we can together glimpse what God is doing, what love is doing. Love is indeed vision. It is vision. It is attentiveness to the very end. Amen.